Hannibal Barca was a brilliant and one of the most well-known military generals in all of history. But what a peculiar name, right? Hannibal? As a Hebrew speaker, the name always sounded a bit familiar to me. So let's talk a bit about the language of ancient Carthage and its close relatives. First, a bit of background. The language of ancient Carthage was Punic, a Phoenician dialect. Phoenician, as the Greco-Roman world called it, is an extinct Semitic language spoken mainly in the Levant, its homeland. But with the spread of the Phoenicians, it later spread to be spoken all around the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians themselves, in all probability, actually called themselves Canaanites, if that's exactly what they were. Phoenician was a term that the Greeks used for these groups of Canaanites in the north that were named after the term Phoeniki, simply after their famous purple dye that they sold. The term Phoenician was later loaned to the Romans to become Punic. In ancient Greek, the PH would have been pronounced as an aspirated P, not an F, and the Latin C was always a hard K, of course. Thus, originally, Punician became Punic. But what about the Phoenician language itself? Like I mentioned, Phoenician is a Semitic language, specifically a Northwest Semitic language. I've already made several videos about the Semitic languages themselves, but if you don't know, the Semitic languages are a language family that comprises languages such as Akkadian, Aramaic, Amharic, Hebrew, Arabic, and of course, Phoenician. The Semitic languages themselves are distantly related to many languages spoken in Northern Africa, such as Shamali, the Berber languages, or Ancient Egyptian, together in a macro-family called Afro-Asiatic. Proto-Semitic, the common ancestor of the Semitic languages, was probably spoken around 4000 BCE and had a lot of consonants, around 30, specifically many emphatic and throaty ones that are still iconic in Arabic, such as ta, ka, sa, or ha. Naturally, many Semitic languages reduced the number of consonants. The Semitic languages are split into a very interesting family tree. First, the East Semitic languages split off first, consisting of Akkadian and Eblide. Akkadian speakers eventually ended up dominating Mesopotamia, making Sumerian extinct, and later diverging to Assyrian and Babylonian dialects. Next, the South Semitic languages split off, with some Semitic languages reaching Ethiopia, becoming languages such as Ge'ez or Amharic. The kingdom of Sheba in modern-day Yemen spoke an extinct South Semitic language. Some South Semitic languages such as Mehri are still alive in Southern Arabia. What happened to the rest? Well, welcome to Arabic. Arabic, a Central Semitic language that formed in Central Western Arabia, spread like wildfire after the early Muslim conquests, and now comprises the vast majority of Semitic speakers today. Contemporary Arabic varieties themselves can arguably be considered separate languages. The last remaining branch, the Northwest Semitic languages, were spoken in the Northwest, famously comprising of Aramaic, which still has some surviving varieties today in Iraq and Syria. It dominated the Fertile Crescent, making Akkadian and the rest extinct, until Arabic came in like a wrecking ball out of the middle of the desert. But besides Aramaic, the Northwest branch also contains the Canaanite languages, dialects, varieties. Canaanite diverged into different varieties around 1000 BCE, mainly Phoenician in the north and Hebrew in the south. But you also had Edomite, Moabite, and Ammonite varieties, which can be considered part of Hebrew. Around this time, the late Bronze Age collapse had just happened. Glorious empires such as Egypt and the Hittites collapsed, leading to the rise of new nations. The sea peoples who might be connected to the biblical Philistines pillaged cities and settled the southern coast of Canaan, forcing the Canaanites in the highlands, the Israelites, to back up from the coast for the time being. But in the north, the coast was now open, and now the Phoenicians can get down to business. The Canaanite varieties were started being written around this time as well, importing the letters from Egyptian hieroglyphs. These Semites started using one symbol for every sound instead of every word, greatly reducing the amount of symbols in writing. The Phoenician script was born. To the south, the southern variety of the script was what's now called the Paleo-Hebrew script. The Greeks eventually copied the Phoenicians and adopted their alphabet. The Romans eventually adopted their alphabet from the Greeks. And today in English and many other languages, the alphabet that is used is of course the Latin alphabet, which ultimately descends from the Phoenician alphabet. As I said, the Phoenicians, due to the vacuum left after the Bronze Age collapse, now dominated northern Canaan and started exploring the Mediterranean. One such colony that eventually formed a civilization on its own is of course Carthage. Meanwhile, the southern Canaanites in the highlands who developed to become the Israelites eventually flourished under the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and in the following centuries produced the most successful and influential book in all of history, and the religion that came with it. Back at the seas, Carthage was founded by the Phoenicians in 1814 BCE by the Phoenician queen Dido, whose name is of the same root as that of King David. Carthage descends from Latin Carthago, which itself was a corruption of the Phoenician Kart Hadasht, meaning new city. In modern Hebrew it's pronounced Kiryah Hadashah. In biblical Hebrew it would have been pronounced more akin to Kiryah Hadashah. Kiryah, or Kart, means something like city or town. In modern Hebrew, the term is a bit archaic, but in the modern state of Israel, there are still many cities that start with Kiryat, such as Kiryat Gat, Kiryat Shmona, or Kiryat Ono. Many other places around the Mediterranean have Phoenician place names, such as Makom Hadash in Sardinia, a corruption of Phoenician Makom Hadash, modern Hebrew Makom Hadash. Cordoba is Cartoba, good city, and Barcelona is named after Hannibal's father, Hannibal Barca. Even the term Spain, which derives from Latin Hispania, probably has a Phoenician origin. One hypothesis is that it came from Ishafan, island of rabbits, because the Phoenicians may have at first assumed that Hispania was an island. But back to Hannibal Barca, the hero of Carthage during the legendary Second Punic War against the growing Roman Republic. Hannibal, or Hannibal, comes from Khani and Baal. Khani comes from the root Chet Nun Nun, or Chanan, to have grace, and is related to the Hebrew names Hanan or Hana. So the names Hannah and its derivatives such as Anna or Ann, which derive from Hebrew Hana, are cognates with the Hani of Hannibal. The most famous Hannah is probably the biblical mother of the prophet Samuel, who later anointed King David. Even the prayer Tachanun in Judaism comes from the same root. The next part of Hannibal's name is Baal. Baal was an iconic Canaanite god, and so Hannibal means something along the lines of Baal has been gracious. The Israelites, who were gradually developing a more monotheistic religion, eventually abandoned Baal, of course. In the Bible, Kings 18, there is an iconic story at Mount Carmel where the prophet Elijah challenged 400 prophets of Baal, which by that time Baal may have been any term for any false Canaanite god. He challenged them to pray to Baal to light a bull on fire. Prayers to Baal, of course, go unanswered all day. After they give up, Elijah dumps water on his bull to show off, prays one sentence, and Shazam, shows those Baal prophets who's boss. The point of the story, of course, is that even apparently after many of the Israelites stopped worshipping Baal, he was still a well-known ancient false god that they used to pray to. The story probably being imagined happening around the period where more and more Israelites became convinced that Abrahamic God was the one true God. So we have Hannibal, but Barca, as in Hannibal Barca, simply means lightning or thunder, after his quick attacks. In modern Hebrew, Barak is still the word for lightning. The Phoenicians and the Israelites were close. The king of Israel, Ahab, had a Phoenician wife from Tyre, named Isabel or Jezebel. According to the Bible, King Solomon borrowed many goods from Tarshish. Tarshish may be connected with Tartessos from Spain, a Phoenician city, of course. Perhaps most famously, Tarshish is talked about in the book of Jonah as a faraway land. The first 3 verses of the book of Jonah are essentially like, Yo, Jonah, travel to the city of Nineveh and tell them that they're sinning like way too much. Nah, Gad, screw that. I guess I'll just go to Tarshish or something, LMAO. But what eventually happened to Carthage? Well, despite being on the ropes, Rome never surrendered in the Second Punic War, and after almost 20 years of fighting, Hannibal and Carthage eventually lost. It was over. Later, the Third Punic War caused the complete destruction of the city in 146 BCE. With Carthage gone, Rome's rise was sealed. Punic would slowly be replaced by Latin. But in the 5th century CE, more than 500 years later, Augustine of Hippo, who lived in Carthage, was writing about how some people still identify as Canaanite or Canaanite and can speak the language. In the homeland, the Levant, the similar Aramaic overran the Canaanite varieties and made them extinct around the same time. Aramaic would rule until Arabic swept through, even reaching modern-day Tunisia, where Carthage used to be. However, this isn't the end of the Canaanite story. In the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, Hebrew underwent a revival. To this day, it is the only language that was dead and completely revived, and now has millions of native speakers in the modern state of Israel. So that's the story behind the name Hannibal, or Hannibal, and his language. Maybe if Rome surrendered after Cannae, this video would have been made in Punic, or a derivative.